Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching this LTC, and we have been waiting for this one for quite a while. I've been hearing rumors about how Warcry is going to get a new edition this summer for, man, at least a year now. So it's real fun to finally get the first look at it. We've been hearing we're going to go to GUR. Now we know what that looks like. We have a whole brand new logo and everything that you can see on the screen. So there's a lot to kind of get excited about, and I know some people are a little trepidatious as well, but we'll talk about that too. So first of all, just if you haven't heard, on the preview yesterday, Sunday, GW showed off sort of this new box set that is going to head off the new edition of Warcry. You can see the sort of box in front of you. Just noting that this is the first time they said edition. They kept saying expansion before when they would highlight it, which means something very different. You know, it's like the way Necromunda had an expansion, which was Ash Wastes. So it's really just an add-on, and you know, you just move your old stuff into the new one if you want to, or you just keep playing the old one. This is sort of a new edition, the way, hopefully not exactly the way Kill Team did, but just coming with new rules, a new setting, something that's supposed to be the entire game too. So if you did matched play, something like that. So how much new rules are we going to get? Who knows, right? They did say old players won't have to, quote, relearn the wheel, which is not how that saying is supposed to go, but that's fine. So they said that, which could mean anything, right? All we know is there will be a few new rules, but in their opinion, not many new rules. So take that as you will, but we do have a new edition, is what it means. Beyond that, though, they showed both the warbands off completely. Now, this is our second time seeing the Horns of Hashut. I still kind of, to be honest, they're not for me. I do wonder if maybe this group is suffering from Games Workshop's metallics. I mean, I think they're well painted, but I don't know. I think I'd like to see them in a different color scheme before I totally say that I don't like them. But as of right now, I don't know about them. I do think that some of their weapon choices are interesting and could be really interesting in game, right? So they've got a flamethrower there, which is really interesting. The way flamethrowers have been done in other games are like, I think in some games it's an automatic hit or something like that. So I'd be curious to see how it would work in Warcry. They've also got grenades, and then you know, there's sort of difference. Some of them having clubs, some of them having forks. I'm wondering if that means there's going to be a lot of range 2 in this warband, which is always useful to have. So I'm interested to see how they play. Games Workshop has done a great job with the last few warbands of making really compelling gameplay to them from a design perspective. They've done a terrible job balancing some of them. Like spiders were extremely recent, and you know, that whole box, that Red Harvest box, was just wildly unbalanced. But from a design standpoint, it's really well done. So I'm curious to see what they do here, even if I don't love the aesthetic. The Rotmeyer Creed, though, really exciting. We had only seen one before, and it was this guy with the little polearm hook thing. These guys are really interesting to me. I love the fact that they are Nurgle, but not the same kind of gross Nurgle that we've seen before. These guys follow an aspect of Nurgle that they call the Leech Lord, and I guess are looking for some form of immortality that way. Who knows what that really means from a lore perspective. We'll learn a lot more, I think. It's always tough to say when they're doing their preview, you know, how much of this, how many grains of salt should we take from this. But either way, I just love the aesthetic. I love, you know, the way they've got sort of the Nurgle bits to their skin, right, with the lesions going on, but it's a lot more subtle than it is on other Nurgle models. I love their shields, their bamboo shields with the little sort of skull decoration. I don't know if that's like they've stretched canvas over the bamboo in the shape of a skull. But I really love that, and like the moss growing on their cloaks with the bamboo aesthetic. I think it just works really well. I love their sort of general improvised weapons, right? These branch pole arms that are, it's made out of a branch, but then they've sort of worked various beast fangs and things of that nature into it. It works really well for their setting of Gur. And I think one thing they talked about really briefly on stream was just that Warcry gives them this place to sort of explore the humans of the mortal realms, because we know that in the AOS setting, most humans are still Chaos followers, just because Order hasn't gotten, you know, they've gotten a foothold now, but they're still not dominating the realms, right? So really interesting, just kind of peek into what different people are doing in the mortal realms, and I think that this aesthetic really works for me. I also really like that they seem like they have a lot of detail, and they do if you wanted to do everything in like a layering and highlighting way, but I think these would take contrast really well. They would take, you know, various like dry brushing really well, just because there are a lot of textures to them, and I really like that. Those are often some of my favorite paint jobs, is when they're very texture forward as opposed to like small details forward. You see a lot of that on the Hashut Warband, for example. Also, just noting, blowpipes means they're going to have ranged first fighters in the warband, and then a net. There hasn't been a bad netter yet in Warcry. I'm sure I'm missing one. If you can think of a really bad netter in the game, let me know in the comments. But as far as I can remember, there isn't a really bad netter in all of Warcry, because when you use those net abilities, you take out a fighter potentially who's, you know, 200, 300 points, and that's just always really valuable. So the fact that Rotmire has access to that, even if it looks like it will be on their second most expensive model, that's still really valuable. The rope hook is really the only weapon here that I think is pretty weird, and it's only on 2 of their fighters. So I'm pretty excited about this, both from an aesthetic standpoint and to see how they'll play given their, you know, mix of shooting and a lot of range 2 in this warband with all those pole arms, and then this net as well. They also showed a ton of terrain, and the terrain I think is gorgeous. I just wanted to put this up on screen. They've got sort of Seraphon bits and pieces of a starship that dropped into the woods here. This kind of Ewok village aesthetic of the bamboo I think is really beautiful. And then the way they've kind of mixed this with various beast bones to kind of show you that you're in the realm of beasts. The way they use Warcry to kind of flesh out their world in ways they haven't shown us before, I think is really wonderful, and just such an awesome use of the game. I also want to note, I didn't really pick up on this until one of my patrons actually said, you know, they've got grasping hands, and then I looked, and then I noticed that these are kind of shaped like muscles, like the branches are muscles to move the grasping hand trees. I thought that was really interesting, and there's a lot you could do with that. So with the terrain, a few folks have also pointed out some issues with the terrain that I think are worth talking about. But first, I just want to talk about just how much I love the aesthetic. I already sort of talked about how it really shows off what the Realm of Beasts are like in a way that would have been hard to imagine. I think sometimes in their written materials, they talk about the realms as just being like completely wild and like nothing you've seen. And then people kind of get turned off by that and being like, well, why can't you just give me a Lord of the Rings forest or something like that? Like, why can't we just have Mirkwood as our scary forest? And this is why. This is why, because when they show what these things actually look like and their sculptors actually do it, they have incredible artists on staff. You know, just the way they're able to communicate these ideas is really beautiful, and kind of creating new worlds that are always fun to be in. The other thing, you know, the grasping hands on the trees, you could have so many different interactive effects with that, right? Do they do damage if you end a move there? Or if you had it be, instead of when you end a move by the tree, maybe it's just at the end of a round, so that you could actually, like, on crits, push someone into the tree's range. That could be really interesting. the hands are mostly like reaching up towards the sky. So what if they were like plucking flyers out of the air? So like if you would be flying and your path would take you within 3 inches of one of these trees, they just take you out of the air. And so they make little no-fly zones. I mean, they could throw things at people, like they could throw fighters off a platform, something like that. There's so much you could do with this kind of these claw hands that these trees have. And I'd love to see what they come up with. The issues that some folks have brought up that I do think are kind of worthwhile to talk about. So a lot of people were saying that the terrain is it's too skinny to put people on. The walkways in our current terrain is already pretty skinny. And they're kind of, if you meet there, you're blocking the whole thing. But I think what's setting people off so much is that the platforms are really skinny, and some of these platforms, like this one on the bottom left, by the way, this skull is blocking off a platform, so you can't see it, but there is a platform on that one. But this platform on the bottom left, you're not going to be able to fit any model that's much bigger than a Stormcast on that platform, just because the tree overhead is going to provide like this ceiling that's going to be hard to slide them in. The platform itself is pretty skinny, and it's not like on those thin walkways. The rules are pretty clear. Any giant fighter is still allowed to walk on those walkways, because you just have to be able to balance the base on them. But on some of these terrains, you know, they're going to be pushing the base off. And then even if you can, like, let's say on this smaller tree here, right, you can pretty clearly fit a pretty big fighter there, even though these will stop you from, right, you'll have to have your base up against these, which means if it was really huge, it would hang off this enough to not balance. But once you do have a fighter there, I don't know, maybe you'll be able to fit one more on there, but that's it, right? You're not going to be able to have a team fight on any of the terrain. And I think some people will miss that, right? Because Red Harvest, you can end up having a team fight on the top platforms. The original terrain, some of the platforms, you can have team fights on them on top of the buildings. So I think people are going to miss that a little bit. There's also a lot of scatter terrain here, because these trees don't take up a lot of space as pieces, right? This one does, and this one does, but these ones are basically just columns. So the actual kind of movement blocking and line of sight blocking is pretty minor, and the board is mostly going to be relying on scatter terrain. And most of the scatter terrain, if you can see kind of around here, most of it doesn't block line of sight. Depending on how big this piece is, part of this is going to block line of sight, but most of it won't. Which is kind of a shame, because Warcry's cover rules are at the moment really inconsequential. Being in cover, it reduces damage somewhat, but not very much. So I think you're going to really miss this in general. Those shooting warbands, cavalry warbands, they're going to have huge advantages here, just because of the fact that there is no movement blocking happening for them. So I think a lot of people are sort of rightfully concerned with that. However, I do think that if the tree rules are solid, that's going to make these tree pieces kind of must-haves in all your games, right? If they have really good tree rules for them. And I could see boards with, say, 2 of these tree pieces, and then mostly original terrain, with a little bit of the Gur scatter pieces. And now you're in these kind of Realm of Beast ruins, because the original ruins terrain is very generic. You could really put that in anywhere, really, if you just like painted it in a Realm of Beasts sort of way. So if the trees have good rules, I could see really incredible boards that are kind of half trees, half original terrain. You could even kind of mix in the big Red Harvest platforms in there to do something really interesting. But as just the tree terrain, I think this board is going to be sort of idiosyncratic in a way that not everyone loves. If you like playing in Soul Drain Forest, though, where it's just like wide open and cavalry win everything, I think you'll really like this this terrain. If you're someone who tends not to really use verticality very much, which honestly most games of Warcry only one player is ever incentivized to get on top. And then there's only sort of there's only a few factions where their rules incentivize them to do it. So in most games, the verticality doesn't play a huge piece, but it does in just enough that you always have to respect it. In these, you won't necessarily respect it as often, but I think that they're absolutely gorgeous, and I'm absolutely going to play on them a bunch and try to, depending on the tree, what the trees do, I'm going to try to mix them up a lot into my other boards. Finally, we have new books. So first we have a new core book. Again, to reiterate, they said there's going to be some changes, but not many. We don't know what that means. Could mean anything. But, you know, no rule set is perfect, right? So there are things about current Warcry that you could improve upon, and I'm interested to see what they try to do. What I'm more interested in is this Warband tome, Rot and Ruin. So it could just be like the Catacombs campaign book and be kind of a lot of nothing. I think a lot of people are betting on that, and that's not a very fun bet, but it is a fairly safe bet, right? But I also wonder if it could signal kind of some greater detail in how factions work. That's one of the things I've sort of talked about that I want, and we're going to do a whole wish listing section here. But the other thing, so it might be faction detail, or it might just be the cards and the abilities, who knows, and then some stuff like that. But I would really like to see sort of greater detail in faction list building here, because I just think that would really improve Warcry, which could use a little bit more in the list building phase, as long as it doesn't make list building more complicated. And I'll get to that in a minute. So with all of this, I just wanted to, we're in this really fun place where we've seen the new edition, we know it's coming, we know what it looks like, but we don't know that much about it. So I think this is the time to kind of plant my flag and talk about my sort of top 5 wishes for what we see in the new edition. And I'm going to start off, number 5, I'm going to be counting down to my favorite. Number 5 is board interactivity. So in the preview, we got this incredible sort of snippet here of this tree with jaws. And this has a few of the grasping hands we've seen, but it's mostly leaves up here actually. It has this gaping maw in the tree, and it's trying to, assumedly trying to eat people. And then we've got this foreground tree that also has a maw and some hands to grab you with. Red Harvest had interactive terrain with the delve rules. It was a really interesting start. Ultimately, I thought it was both too much and not enough, where the lava in Red Harvest really like scrunched up the board and made it hard to maneuver in. It was really punishing to big models. And then the delve rules like pretty much never mattered until they mattered way too much and sort of were way too important. But as kind of as a start to giving this a try, I really loved it. I guess I loved what it meant instead of what it really did. And that's one of the things I really want to see with this new edition. There's so much you could expand on. We could see future predatory terrain pieces. They've never sold like a single piece of terrain for Warcry before. Even though there's some they probably could. Like, people love the statue head platform a ton, so they could probably just sell that on its own, and I think people would buy it. It's also one of the best line of sight blocking terrain pieces that's in the game. But we could see that with this. I would hope, the price on just a piece of terrain wouldn't be that much. I know from the latest incarnation they sold that people are a little bit concerned about how much GW tries to charge for just terrain, but I'd be really excited to see what they could come up with the model version of this picture here. It's pretty rare that GW shows a picture of something, sort of a zoomed in picture of something that isn't a model. They're pretty careful about that actually, so I'm expecting we see something like this, unless this is supposed to be the trees that we saw in the original box, which is kind of odd, right? Because it doesn't look anything like them. None of them have jaws. They just have the grasping hands. I also just love how, the trees have muscles. This again tells me that they should be doing something, and that the board should be like another character. in the original game, right, it was like the Raptorics and the Furies. Those were the sort of things where you're playing against the board, and they would only come up in certain twists. Having this with maybe fewer chaotic beasts, but more just things that the board does, I think could be a more interesting way to have it be less per game than when you have chaotic beasts, but in every game, which I would really love. The fourth, I'm really just hoping for no major changes to the core gameplay loop of Warcry. And by core gameplay, I mean each fighter having 2 actions. You get to use your wild dice, and then you alternate activations. It just makes for an incredibly smooth experience. I know Kill Team experimented with giving some fighters 3 actions, some fighters only 1 action. I'd prefer not to see that, but if it happens, it wouldn't be heartbreaking. It would just be annoying as just another thing to remember during the core gameplay loop. I also really don't want them to change the fact that right now you only roll 1 set of dice per each attack activation. There's no I roll, then you roll saves, then maybe you roll to see what saves you re-roll. There's none of that crap. It bogs down the game. No skirmish game should have any of that, and so I really hope that they've kind of stuck with that. So I'm just really hoping any changes they make, I really hope it's just towards some of the kind of more gray area parts of rules, and not really pieces of the core game loop. I think that would be really heartbreaking. Finally, or not finally, third, I would love it to see a stat rebalance. So they're kind of universal linear points algorithm. I've harped on this a lot, but the fact that they have the same points algorithm for every faction, the fact that it is linear, so it breaks down at both ends, where with really cheap models being way too cheap and a lot of expensive models being some of the best things you can do in the game. I'm really concerned because a lot of the Underworlds models or Underworlds warbands have extremely spammable cheap models in them. They've figured out that cheap flight is a problem, right? We're not going to see a 45-point Aetherwing ever again. But in general, like slow things are still being priced incredibly cheaply in a spammable way where it just doesn't work, right? And then you've also got these spiders, which are 35 points for something that's not even slow, right? That's actually pretty fast and does a ton of damage. And for some reason, it's still being priced cheaply because you can always just price something to the floor because of what toughness costs in their points algorithm and what strength costs in their points algorithm. And those points algorithms just don't work. Any linear points algorithm is only going to function in a narrow band where it closely aligns with how much value you actually get. But anytime you get towards sort of one end of that line, the actual value is going on a much more complex curve, right? So if you don't sort of fix that in your, I'm trying not to get too mathy, right? But the issue is having linear points algorithms just does not work. I really would like to see them do a stat rebalance. They put a ton of work into 40k and AOS stats as far as like how much things should cost, and I would like to see just like a fraction of that here in Warcry. They've also got, I wouldn't mind seeing changes to the base stats too. Certain models just have no purpose because of kind of what they do. That's probably always going to be true. There's so many models in the game, but it would be nice to see it just kind of shaken up a little bit. A major shakeup obviously would upset a lot of people if you just ended up dumpstering everybody's warbands, but minor shakeups tend to be sort of met with, well, people will complain on the internet no matter what you do, but a minor shakeup does tend to make the game a little more fresh. Second, I'd love to see some list building wrinkles. Their campaign artifact system is really fun and I think works really well, and I'd love to see faction-specific matched play artifacts that kind of work the way the campaign artifacts do. You could also go for really simple allegiance abilities, so maybe just one per faction, something that would make list building a little bit different for one faction than it is for the other faction. At the moment, like I've talked about the competitive list building template, at the moment, right, you can kind of do the same type of list for every faction that has the tools to do it, and it's usually correct to do so. There's only a few factions where, for this faction, you want to be doing the swarm version of a template, and it's really kind of the same template. It's a swarm template, and then there's an elite template, and there's really only like 3 correct ways to build a warband right now, it's just every faction either can build one of these 3 competitive ways to build a faction, or it can't, and then it's not a competitive faction. I would love to see that change a little bit, or at least make it so that, you know, just the approach you take on different factions is a little more different, and allegiance abilities are good at that. It also opens up the ally space. If you say that the allies can't benefit from the allegiance abilities, now you can be way more aggressive with how you point leaders and how you do things with leaders, because they would be essentially taking a tax going into a different faction, and that would be cool too, because I like when your leader is kind of running the show in your warband. I think that creates a really engaging kind of narrative experience for people, and is still pretty memorable in matched play too. So being able to sort of be aggressive with the way you design leaders is really great, as long as you don't have to worry about putting them into every warband, right? And so something like allegiance abilities would give you the freedom to do that. So I would love to see one or the other. I would really not like to see both. I think if you had both, it gets too complicated. Now you're getting towards you know, AOS and 40k range, where it's like you're picking your artifact, your allegiance ability. But, you know, let's say if each faction could choose between 3 different artifacts, or like if there was 1 or 2 artifacts, let's say you set this up, right? Every Grand Alliance has 1 generic artifact that their leader can take, or they can choose 1 faction artifact, and you get either one. That would be, I think, a great system where it would be really simple for matched play. It would just kind of follow onto the campaign system for that. Or you could just have each faction just has an allegiance ability that applies to all their models, and it would only be 1 ability. Something like that would be, I think, really fun, and it wouldn't bog down list building too much. The danger would be if you started doing both, and now you have to think about how the artifacts interact with the allegiance abilities, and then how much that should affect how you point cost models. That becomes a little bit more than I think they'd be sort of able to manage for a skirmish game, but I would love to see one of these 2 changes. Finally, and I really hope we get this, and I'm still crossing my fingers, I think we will, non-Slaves to Darkness bespoke warbands. We got this Nurgle warband. That's awesome to see, but I would also love to see some non-chaos ones. We're in kind of a jungle swamp. Cruel Boys live in swamps. I think a Cruel Boys warband would be really cool. They use these warbands to show like different twists on a faction. So like Rotmire is a totally different twist on Nurgle, right? Or let's see, you know, the Cainite Shadowstalkers are just like, they're like Daughters of Cain, but also totally different than Daughters of Cain, but they clearly fit in the same umbrella faction. I want to see things like that, right? So I want to see like Feral Seraphon. You know, we've got this starship that's exploded in Gur. I want to see the Seraphon that survived the crash and are just like a little crazy from being in the realm of beasts. I want to see sort of beastly Sylvaneth. Does that mean like Kurnothi, right? The fauna to the flora that is Sylvaneth. I want to see that, and I think that a Warcry warband would be the perfect spot for it, right? Skaith's Wild Hunt from Underworlds is iconic at this point. People love that Underworlds warband just because of what it meant for its faction. I would love to see that expanded in Warcry. The Ossiarch Bone Reapers Ivory Host, an entire sub-faction of Ossiarch Bone Reapers. Their whole thing is like, this is their sort of invasion into the realm of beasts, is this host, and this host is like just barely keeping it together as far as like the Ossiarch efficiency is concerned with, because they're sort of becoming more and more bestial and less of these like cold-blooded killers that the Ossiarch Bone Reapers are supposed to be like, and they've got this thing of like, to defeat the beast you must be the beast, and I would love to see like bestial OCR Bone Reapers that are kind of, you know, the Bone Reapers they're these bone amalgamations, right? Bones that have been smushed together to form what are essentially human skeletons and horse skeletons, right? But in kind of construct form. I would love to see like beast skeletons in construct form, if that makes sense. Give me like the OCR Bone Reaper rhinoceros or something, right? I think that would be really sweet. Fellwater. This is a subsection of Troggoths. There are Fellwater Troggoths. There's the Fellwater Troggoth Hag. I've always wanted to see Fellwater expanded into its own army. I just think that their aesthetic is totally different than anything in Destruction, but also like really fits with kind of what Destruction is all about. I think a Warcry warband would be the perfect place to put that. You could have an elite Warcry warband for the first time, like an elite bespoke, where it's just like 4 Troggoths and maybe 2 like little minion creatures or something like that, and it could be really, really cool and just something totally different than what we've seen before, and I would love to see that. You could also do like a foresty Beast of Chaos. Everyone is always talking about how a new Beast of Chaos model is right around the corner, and then they keep getting their hearts broken. The Horns of Hashut had several rumor engines that were tied to Beasts of Chaos that turned out to be Horns of Hashut. The Gur terrain that they showed us, multiple rumor engines that were assumed to be Beasts of Chaos that turned out not to be. So it'd be pretty mean if they go through this whole thing and never see a Beasts of Chaos model, and all the Beasts of Chaos players are just like clawing their eyes out because they thought that they would get this thing and they never did. In some ways that would be funny, but I would also just like to see a Beast of Chaos warband. The other thing is you could see like Kragnos comes from a race of centaur people, right? I think it would be really cool to see those centaur people as models. I know his whole race was supposed to be wiped out, right? But let's see like some survivors from that race just like hanging on and hanging out in this realm of beast swamp. I think that could be really cool, and I wanted to put these out there, not because I'm predicting any of these, but just to show like what kind of incredible variation that you could get out of this game if you really try to fully embrace this new setting that we're doing and try to treat it the way they treated the Bloodwind Spoil. I mean, they gave us these sort of pan chaos Thunderdome cosplay setting that I think, you know, nobody had really imagined before, and I think it caught a lot of people, and I think that's part of what makes Warcry so popular, right? So I would love to see more of that, where they just take that same idea and that same like just intense expression and try to bring that to the realm of beast and really show us, you know, I think a lot of people were kind of dismayed by this new logo. They thought it looked kind of childlike or something. Give us a reason to love this logo. Give us this more aesthetic in this place. And I think people would get excited for it. I think, you know, just in general, this is a really beautiful board. And I really want them to leverage that as much as they can. So I'm going to be back to creating, finalizing my last few list building videos while we kind of check for new stuff on this box. I will be getting this box as early as I can to kind of unbox it and try to get a game in, even if I'm just playing with gray plastic, just to get my first observations on the box. I'll try to do that as early as possible. Hopefully this comes out soon enough that, you know, we can be playing with the new rules by Nova. Seems like maybe the timeline will make Gen Con sort of the last sort of send-off to the old edition, and Nova the kind of ushering in the new edition. I think that would be really exciting, especially for the folks who are going to be at both tournaments. I'm not going to be able to make Gen Con, really, unfortunately, but I will be at Nova, and I'm really excited about it. So here's the new edition. Let me know what you think of it in the comments, and until the next video, may all your rolls be crits.